intelligence is an interesting concept. It's very controversial. In fact, one of the things that continually happens over and over again in psychology is that psychologists discover all sorts of new kinds of intelligence. And, the biggest two proponents of that sort of thing, I suppose, were Bob Sternberg, who came up with this thing he called practical intelligence, and then Howard Gardner, who came up with the theory of multiple intelligences, which had a very large effect on educational psychology when the theory was first proposed. And that's not saying much, because generally speaking, it's very difficult to find a discipline that's more susceptible to fads than educational psychology. And as far as I can tell, generally speaking, each fad is worse than the previous one. So, Gardner posited that I think there were 7 or 8 different intelligences: linguistic, musical, logical, mathematical, spatial, body kinesthetic, intrapersonal, and interpersonal. And people talk about emotional intelligence, and they talk about practical intelligence. And as far as I'm concerned, all of that's complete rubbish. And there's technical reasons for that. I mean, there's technical and philosophical reasons for that. The first thing is, you can't just mess up a word. The whole point of having a word is so that it defines some things, it describes some things, and doesn't describe other things, right? And so you can make the word intelligence account for whatever you want. So you can say that the ability to dance is a form of intelligence. But the problem with that is you blur out the word so badly you can't tell what it means anymore. And I would also point out, we had perfectly good words for those major intelligences. We called them talents. And so it's perfectly reasonable to make a distinction between a talent and intelligence. Now, you might say, well, how the hell do you know the difference? Like, if things look similar to some degree, then how do you know if they're the same or different? Well, that's exactly what you do when you do the construct validity process. So let's say you rated a number of people on their dancing ability, and then you rated a number of people on their ability to multiply two-digit numbers in their head quickly. Well, then, you see, technically, if both of those were intelligences, then the people who could dance better could multiply two-digit numbers faster in their head. And they would be slightly positively, See, that's what happens when I don't have any Diet Coke. So anyways, if intelligence was the right word to subsume both of those, then what you'd see is there would be a high correlation. The people who were good dancers would also be the ones who could multiply most rapidly. And I mean multiply in their head. But you're not going to be able to extract out a single factor like that. It's just not the case that those things associate like that. So, for something to be one phenomena, the things that it... Obviously, I've talked too much this semester. All the things that are subsumed under that definition have to be correlated, and highly correlated, because otherwise they're not the same thing. It's the definition of the same thing. Now, IQ is a very peculiar construct, a very unique construct from a psychological perspective, but also more generally from a social science perspective, because IQ has the most predictive validity of anything ever discovered in the social sciences, period. And IQ is a very good predictor of health, it's a predictor of longevity, it's a predictor of resistance to post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a predictor of, obviously, occupational status, it's a predictor of educational success, it's a predictor of income. It's a very powerful predictor. And here's another way of conceptualizing its effect. So imagine that you could choose how you were going to be when you were born. This is in North America, because it's going to vary by society, at least to some degree. You get to be born into a family that's at the 95th percentile for wealth, or you get to be born at the 95th percentile for intelligence. Who's better off at the age of 40? And the answer is the person who picks being born with an IQ in the 95th percentile at birth. It's a more powerful predictor of long-term life outcome than familial wealth. So, and it shows up everywhere. Like, one of the things we did recently was look at disgust sensitivity. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about conscientiousness, because orderly people seem to be more sensitive to disgust than disorderly people. That seems to be why they're orderly. But the higher you are in IQ, the less disgust sensitive you are. Now, we don't know exactly why that is. Maybe it's because, maybe you could make the inference that IQ is related in some way to the physiological integrity of the cortex, rather than the limbic system, which, is the source of, say, emotions and motivations. And the more powerful it is, the more inhibitory capacity it has over the more fundamental motivations and emotions. You could make that case. The problem is that intelligent people don't necessarily seem to be any less impulsive. So, and you can have a pretty vicious personality disorder that's characterized by extremely disorganized behavior and a complete inability to put long-term plans into operation and still have a high IQ. So, one of the things we really can't figure out, it's just a hell of a thing to try to figure out, is like the relationship between IQ and industriousness is 0. And that just makes no sense to me, because most of the brain models are predicated on the idea that your ability to engage in long-term planning is a factor that's associated with intelligence. But then industrious people seem to not only engage in long-term planning, they seem to do it right, so that if they're more industrious, they put their plans into operation, then the plans actually work. But it's not correlated with IQ. So then I can't figure out, well, obviously the industrious person in some way is able to regulate their own behavior. They're not procrastinating, for example. And you'd think that the ability to not procrastinate would be a cognitive feature, but it doesn't seem to be. And we have no idea what makes people industrious, and we can't figure it out. So it's this incredibly potent predictor. It's just about as powerful as IQ. And we have no idea what it is. So if you have a smart idea about that and you want to pursue it, feel free, because there's a big mystery there that no one's been able to crack, and we've been at it for a long time and have had almost no success. We had people do things like, we'd give them sentences of N's, M's, and U's, sort of randomly distributed, and then we'd have them count the U's, like a whole page of sentences. They're not sentences, they're just strings of letters. Count the U's. How useless, you'd think that someone industrious would do that better. It's like they don't. That's an IQ test. The people who can count the U's faster have higher IQs. Almost everything that you would do where it has to do with manipulation of abstractions of any sort, even something that basic, seems to be fundamentally associated with IQ. People with higher IQs have slightly bigger heads if you control for body size. They have slightly bigger brains if you control for body size. The axons on their neurons are a bit thicker, so the electrical messages seem to travel a little bit more efficiently. They are slightly faster in simple reflex tests, so it goes right down to the level of, because they're simple reflex, light goes on, push a button. There's not many neurons mediating that response, chains of neurons. There's only a few neurons communicating so that you can do that. But even at that relatively simple processing level, IQ is associated with speed. So there's a physiological component. You're less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease if you have a high IQ. And maybe that's because your brain is just more robust, so you could sustain damage, say, of up to 50% of your brain, and you wouldn't even show it if you have a sufficiently high IQ. Whereas if you're on the bottom end of the IQ distribution, you seem to be much more susceptible to physiological damage. Nutrition is a big predictor of IQ variation. So, and a lot of that's been hammered out of modern societies, So 150 years ago, people's IQ was pretty tightly associated with their nutritional status. But now, there are very few people in North America who don't have enough to eat, even though there's some variation in quality of diet. And that's flattened out a lot of the cultural variability in intelligence.